Hello everyone and welcome to week 4 of Poll 205, Women in Politics. This week is going to be another relatively short lecture all about the gender gap. What is it, where does it come from, and will it ever go away? Last week we learned that the gender gap refers to gender-based differences in public opinion, party preference, and vote choice. But what do these differences look like exactly? Well, since about the late 1980s, we've seen a consistent trend in women having slightly higher turnout than men. When we look at intersectional breakdowns from both race and gender, we see women pretty consistently turn out more than men across racial groups. And when we look at educational breakdowns, we see that women with high school diplomas and some college education turn out at slightly higher rates than men. But when we look at the differences between men and women on the extreme ends of this distribution, meaning those who have the least amount of education versus those with the most amount of education, we see very little differences between men and women's turnout. Another intriguing aspect of the gender gap is how men and women associate with different political parties. In this chart here, we see that most men generally gravitate toward the Republican Party, when a significant amount of women identify with the Democratic Party. But one thing that I want you to keep in mind here relates to what we just talked about on the previous slide, intersectionality. So intersectionality is a theoretical framework for understanding how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create unique modes of political participation. So while this chart may make it appear as though most women vote for Democrats and most men vote for Republicans, that would be a vast exaggeration of voting behavior in the United States. So here's a breakdown of which party people have voted for by gender over the last 40 years. And again, we see that anywhere between 45 to 55% of women generally vote for the Democratic presidential candidate, whereas about 41 to 45% of men generally vote for the Democratic presidential candidate. But let's dive into the 2016 presidential election results a bit to put this all into perspective, and again, keeping in mind this concept of intersectionality. Now, the data I'm going to present here is only going to focus on breakdowns of women and subgroups of women, but I do just want to keep in mind that you see very similar differences among subgroups of men as well. But I'm trying to keep these lectures on the shorter side for you guys, so we're just going to focus on women voters in 2016. So according to 2016 exit polling, approximately 54% of all women voters supported Hillary Clinton, compared to about 42% of all women who supported Trump. So this is pretty much in line with the previous graph that we looked at. But when we take into account different racial subgroups or intersectional identities of women, we see a very different picture. According to the same exit poll data, about 94% of Black women supported Hillary Clinton, compared to about 3% of Black women who voted for Trump. About 70% of Hispanic women voted for Hillary Clinton, and about 25% voted for Donald Trump. And white women was the only racial subgroup of women who were more likely to vote for Donald Trump at 52%, compared to 43% of white women who voted for Hillary Clinton. We get an even better sense of the magnitude of the gender gap when we look at other socioeconomic factors that drive vote choice and political participation. College-educated white women were the only group of white women who were more likely to vote for Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump at 51 to 44%. Marital status is another huge predictor. 63% of all unmarried women supported Hillary Clinton, compared to 32% who voted for Trump. So one of the key objectives of this lecture is to demonstrate that women voters are not monolithic voting blocs. As we can see by examining different socioeconomic factors, demographics, race, different types of women have different partisan loyalties. And it's a very broad overstatement to just say most women vote for Democrats. In fact, white women are increasingly identifying with the Republican Party. So where does this gender gap come from? Why does it exist? Well, we already know that men and women each constitute half of the United States population. But that's about as equal a statistic as you're going to find in the United States. So when we're trying to understand why men and women express different political behaviors, I think it's really important to first recognize the differences in life experiences between men and women. Because government essentially boils down to regulating society, we need to understand the differential advantages or disadvantages of being male or female in society if we want a government that effectively governs. If men and women don't have the same opportunities or the same life experiences or face the same obstacles, then is it possible for a government that is mostly male to identify, understand, and address issues that disproportionately affect women? The same logic applies with racial identities in America. If lawmakers are mostly white, do they really understand the cultural, social, economic, and political challenges that people of color face? This logic spans across all groups who are underrepresented in American politics, and this is why it's so critical for our government to be representative of all groups in society. If we don't see inequity personally, if we don't live it, if we don't experience it, then it can be more difficult to recognize that there are in fact disparities which exist. For instance, while we do know that the gender pay gap does exist, we see that it's even more significant for women of color. We know that women, particularly those who are single and have children, are more likely to live in poverty. We know that there are cultural biases in policing that disproportionately affect Black Americans. We know there is systemic bias in our criminal justice system that disproportionately affects men and people of color. And while over the last few decades, women have begun to surpass men in college enrollment and attainment of college degrees, we still see a pretty significant racial gap in general. There are unfortunately many other figures that I could show you that illustrate the racial and gender disparities in our economy, in society, and in politics, but the point of the matter is to highlight that even today, varying degrees of inequity continue to exist between men and women, and we often see those inequities are even more pronounced among non-white communities. And these are just some of the primary reasons why we see such drastic differences in political behavior, not only between men and women, but between different racial subgroups as well. So let's do a quick overview of the major points to take away from this week. What are some of the major reasons that explain this gap? Well, first you have economic reasons. As discussed in this lecture, women face more economic obstacles than men. They make less money, they're more likely to live in poverty, and thus more likely to rely on government-provided benefits. Which brings us to point number 2, normative expectations of government. If women are more reliant on government-provided social programs and entitlements, then it makes natural sense that they would gravitate toward the party that advocates that type of agenda. In its most crude and oversimplified sense, the Democratic Party advocates for redistributions of wealth, aka bigger government, in order to create a more level playing field for all members of society, while Republicans generally advocate for more individualistic or small government policies which reduce the amount of government interference in our daily lives. Now maybe you can see where I'm going with this. Brings me to point number 3, political polarization. Why do we see such vast gaps between men and women? Well, because of our two-party system. Voters tend to oversimplify the premises of each political party. So you end up with these stereotypes of each party where you either have to choose Democrats, who want to take all of your money and give it to other people, or Republicans, who only care about individualism and maintaining the status quo. Now, while both of these statements are gross over-exaggerations, this is exactly how both parties have decided to demonize one another. So we end up with blocks of voters who both believe that the opposite party presents an existential threat to our democracy. Which brings us to my final point, backlash. As we become more polarized, we become further entrenched in an us versus them mentality. These are our hardcore ideological extremists within both parties that essentially believe that their party is the absolute, unequivocal answer to whatever problem it is they perceive in society. So you see enormous backlash among voters. You see more individuals identify as independents. You see more moderate voters flip parties because they disagree with the stereotypes that symbolize their party. And we end up in a really dangerous place for democracy that breeds divisiveness between the voters and fosters an environment of gender and racial resentment in both parties. So, based upon everything we've talked about today, I want to leave you with one major question. Do you think that the gender gap will continue to characterize American politics for the foreseeable future? With feminism gaining more traction in American politics, especially through the Me Too movement, and racial issues becoming more salient with the Black Lives Matter movement, both parties are facing a significant challenge on how to speak about these issues in a way that doesn't alienate other voters. Otherwise, politicians will simply continue to benefit from us blaming each other rather than voters holding their government accountable. Well, that's it for this week. I know that was kind of a gloomy ending to end the lecture on, but I've really enjoyed doing these lectures for you guys. I'm really excited to see what you guys have to say about some of the major topics we've discussed in the unit discussion board that's going to be happening next week. So I'll be posting more details about what to expect for that in next week's module, but otherwise that's it for this week's lecture. I hope you enjoyed. Stay healthy, stay safe, and as always, thanks for watching.